Just going to see if Jeannie will come down and read that gospel one more time while you're standing. Just kidding. You may be seated. Good morning, boys and girls. I got a question for you guys. How many of you guys love to go to the doctor's office when you're sick? Oh, at least we have one here who loves to go to the doctor's office. You like going to the doctor's office even when you're sick? If you go to the doctor's office, what's the one thing? I hate to even bring this up. Parents may shoot me after this, but what's the one thing you're afraid of? I'm still afraid of this when I go to the doctor's office. What is it? A shot. That's exactly right. Shots are not something we want, are they? We have to get them. I had to get them. Your parents had to get them. Your grandparents had to get them. We have to get them, but we don't want them, really, because they're a little scary, right? But what happens after you get the shot? You get a Band-Aid. What's on the Band-Aid? Anything cool? That you get like a Batman Band-Aid or a Superman Band-Aid? You ever got one of those? You get nothing. Your doctor does. You get a sticker. Stickers are good. You get lollipops. Those are good. So you at least get something out of this whole experience, right? What else happens to you when you get home? If you've been sick and you have to get a shot, what happens? You what? You miss school. See, I didn't even think about the extra things you get if you get a shot. What I was trying to get at is what? What happens to you? Aoife, what happens to you if you've been sick? You feel better. That's what I was looking for, right? And it's hard because you were sick, and I bet when you were sick, you were ready to go to the doctor, right? You probably were like, I want to get better. I know all of your parents are. As soon as we get the least bit sick, we are ready to go to the doctor and get the medicine and get the shot so we can feel better. I'm nervous when my own daughter has her hand raised. Yes, Aoife. Oh, you get cuddled. You get taken care of. You get treated like a child needs to be treated, right? Somebody takes care of you, right? So you get all that stuff. But more importantly, you get better when you get home. And all of us want that. Well, I'm asking you these weird questions because today, I don't know if you heard that first reading we had. It's about these people who are going through the wilderness, which is a big desert. What are deserts? Are deserts cold? No, generally they're very hot, right? And these people, they were not in good shape where they were. Moses had to go and get them out of there. They were in big trouble. Things were not going well for them. But when they get out in the desert and they find out it's going to be tough, that it's hot out there, that they're a long way from what they're used to, what does it make them want to do? They're ready to go back to where they came from. The very place that Moses got them out of, they're ready to go back to because they're thirsty. And of course, all of us, when we get thirsty, we get a little agitated. Any of your family ever get hungry and get that thing we call hangry? Yeah, well, thirsty has that same kind of deal. When we get thirsty, we get agitated too. And that's what happened today in that story. And you know what? Moses even says, come on, God, I need some help here. You know what God tells him to do? He says, take your staff and hit the rock. Now, have you guys ever taken a stick and hit a big rock before? Does anything ever come out of it? No. But in the story today, guess what? To help the people, to show them that God is trying to take them out of where they've been and bring them healing and give them something new, water comes out of the rock to help them. And it kind of reminds me of the story of when you get that shot. You are ready when you find out it's coming to hit back into the car and go home, right? But you get the shot, and guess what happens? You get healed. And that's an image God is giving us here in this story of Moses and the Israelites, that sometimes to let go of things we want to let go of, or even when we think we don't want to do them anymore, is hard to do. But God promises us that he will fill us up, he will help us if we just trust him, and that's what they have to do. So look out at all these people, and they know what's coming next. I want you to tell them on the count of 3 who it is that loves them. And we talked about Moses, we talked about God, talked about doctors. We know they love them, but I'm going for Jesus, all right? So on the count of 3, let them know who it is who loves them. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Jesus! Well done. Good morning. I want to begin this morning with a question for all of you. Maybe you heard a little bit of it there when I was talking to the children, but what is it that you yourself are most thirsty for in your life right now? I think all of us would agree that we all have those moments when we find ourselves very thirsty for something we're longing for. So what is it that makes us thirst the most in our lives today? Very often that thirst can just be for the obvious, the thirst for a drink of something liquid, which can instantaneously quench us of the thirst we're feeling. Living here in the South, if we do just about anything outdoors during the high heat of the summer months, we will find ourselves absolutely thirsty for that most basic and essential liquid component of our human lives, water. But what else do we constantly find ourselves thirsting after? And how deep does that thirst take us into a spiritual life? Just over 2 decades ago, long before I ever imagined that I would become the priest and rector of a parish with a long history of service and outreach to the people in the country of Honduras, I found myself joining a group of students along with a local church group in town on a trip to the southernmost part of that same country in Honduras. After we landed in the city of Tegucigalpa, we loaded a bus and we traveled in the different direction that I know St. Thomas goes to. We traveled to the south, to the small town of El Corpus, with plans to leave from there and hike a long distance out into the Honduran mountains along the Nicaraguan border to spend a week working in a tiny Honduran village out in the Campo. Back in the spring of 2001, when I went on this trip, I was still a strapping young man in my mid-20s with that youthful feeling of invincibility that all of us have when we are in that age group. For me, what was most on my mind as we loaded up our backpacks and supplies and tied them on the back of what must have been the skinniest horse I'd ever seen before was that I was about to go do something exciting. I was about to go out and do something new. I was going to trek out into the jungle and use my skills to help others and to learn while I was there. My thirst, you might say, was being quenched in that moment, or so I thought. I was in Honduras with a group of other students from Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, where I was a graduate student at that time. And we'd come down to Central America to really dive in and learn about the culture and to work in the sustainable development practices of the rural campesino farmers of that particular southern region, with the hope of being able to bring back that information and apply that work to our studies of rural communities in central and southern Appalachia. I'd been looking forward to this trip for most of that semester year, and I was ready to get started with the hard work I knew was going to happen in the Honduran community I was going to serve. And on that particular morning, as we got going with all our tools and backpacks and supplies in the scorching hot Honduran sun, the invincible me made one mistake. I didn't think about checking out the water bottle that I had tucked into the side pocket of my backpack on the back of that very sad and skinny horse. As we walked along up into the mountains that morning and I began to feel the sweat pouring out from under the cool straw hat I'd bought in Tegucigalpa, I reached over for my water bottle and suddenly realized in horror that it was not even halfway full. While we kept walking, I quickly consumed what little bit of water I had left, and with several more miles to go on the rough terrain and trails, I could almost feel the little bit of hydration I had left in me evaporating by the second through the pores of my warming skin. It wasn't long before I began to noticeably slow down and fall behind the rest of the group. Several of my colleagues took notice and offered me some of their water, but at that moment we were already in short supply for all of us, and I didn't feel it was right for me to be drinking up other people's much needed water. All of a sudden I felt myself starting to lose my balance, and with my visible red-hot skin from serious dehydration, everyone knew that I was on the verge of a heat stroke. And there we were with no one to call for help, with the only opportunity to reach that help in retracing our steps all the way back to the town of El Corpus. At that frightening moment, our Honduran guide, who was leading our trek to the village where he himself had lived his entire life, suddenly made a decision to redirect us into the trees off the main path we were on. And within what felt like only 5 minutes or so, we were suddenly standing in front of the door of a little cabin in the jungle. An elderly woman opened the door to that cabin, and after our guide told her in Spanish what was happening, she hurried us in and set me down on a small bench in the middle of her dirt floor hut. Then, after she disappeared quickly out another door at the rear of the house, she reappeared with a large wood bowl full of the one thing I desperately needed: water. Now, I knew that we gringos were supposed to purify any water that we were going to be drinking down there in Honduras, but in that moment I felt I was in a life or death situation. So I took that wooden bowl from that kind woman and I drank every drop that she'd given me. As she quickly went out again and came back with more water, I could physically feel that water moving down my throat and into my stomach and out into my body as I drank the entire bowl the second time. And after that, we just began to sit together in silence for a long time. As my body finally began to cool back down and my strength began to return, we suddenly began to smile at each other, and finally, with the most sincere thank you I could muster in my very broken Spanish, we got up and left that little cabin, got back on the trail, and eventually made it to the village we were seeking. Today, all these years later, as much as I struggle to remember a lot of those other details of that trip to Honduras 22 years ago, the one thing I vividly remember is the kind, generous face of the woman that gave me the water and her smile, and that wooden bowl that she placed into my hands. And I can honestly tell you, it's as if I can still taste that cool water that saved my life and restored me that day. I'm not sure I've ever tasted water that was as wonderful and refreshing as the water that day, and I think it is safe to say that when I am thirsty, that's the water I remember and find myself longing for all the way to now. Well, this morning, the thirst for that good, clean, true water we seek out and use to refresh us and restore us is exactly what seems to be flowing through our Bible readings on this third Sunday of our desert journey in the season of Lent. Today, in our first reading from the book of Exodus, it is the entire Israelite community following Moses through the wilderness who are ready to go back into the slavery they've been freed from in Egypt to avoid dying of thirst in the heat of that desert wilderness. And in that amazing reading that we just heard from the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John, filled up with the deeper meanings John's Gospel always carries within it, we are told the story of another thirsting woman, a Samaritan woman, who is not so much suffering from physical heat stroke or dehydration at that well in Sychar, but instead is suffering from a deep thirst for the true hydration of the Spirit, which she, whether she knows it or not, has been seeking out in everything she's done her entire life. The gospel begins this morning by telling us that Jesus himself is tired out from this journey he's been on, preaching and teaching and performing miracles. And so today he has gone to Jacob's well in the brightest light of the day, high noon, to seek out some rest. But if we recognize the deep meaning found in the stories the writer of John's gospel always seeks to pull from the Hebrew Bible, then we can't miss a much deeper, more revealing connection, I think, to Jesus going to this particular well to find rest in the heat of the bright sunshine of midday. For it is at wells in the Hebrew Bible that a bridegroom goes to not seek rest, but to find a bride. It will be the servant of Abraham in the book of Genesis who finds Rebekah, a wife and companion for Isaac, at a well. And also Jacob finding Rachel at that very same well in the Hebrew Scriptures where we find Jesus this morning. So Jesus, who is, we know now, the bridegroom given by God for the whole world, the bridegroom for his bride, the church, is seeking out a deep and loving, giving relationship. And so in this case, that relationship he seems to be seeking will be with a Samaritan woman who suddenly walks up to the well in the very heat of that day. When Jesus sees the woman approaching with her empty water jar, Jesus asks her to draw out water from that well and then to present and give that water directly to him. And when she is in shock that a Jewish man would be asking a Samaritan woman for a drink, because Jews and Samaritans were not ones to ask each other for anything, much less converse together, Jesus tells her he wants her to ask him for what he can give her, which is living water. And he invites her in that moment, as she stumbles and tries to figure out who she's speaking to why not go and bring your husband with you for this? Of course, in the reply, the woman will admit that she does not have a spouse and a partner, which allows Jesus to reach deeper into her soul like a physician diagnosing an ailment, and to identify what she has actually been thirsting for her whole life, whether she has gone to this well or not. Jesus begins his diagnosis by saying, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." Now, it sounds like Jesus is being rough on her. But Jesus says this not to shame the woman, but instead to identify what she is seeking. Perhaps she's sought out true love that's failed her. Maybe she's sought out security or wealth that's never been given. Maybe she's been looking for a teacher or a rabbi. Maybe she is seeking someone to acknowledge her wisdom and her ability and her leadership. Whatever it is, in each case, what she has sought after has never seemed to fulfill what it is supposed to promise. And it has sent her thirsty back and forth over and over again to that well to draw out some kind of water that will quench her thirst. In her meeting with Jesus, he wants to take her unfilled water jar from her in that moment and to provide her with a spiritual living water that will never run out or leave her thirsty, something different she didn't know she was seeking for. Jesus says, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, "Give me a drink," you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Everyone who drinks of this earthly water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life. Brothers and sisters, that Samaritan woman is meant to be an image of all of us who are always finding ourselves lost as we seek out these earthly things that we think we are thirsty for, only to discover that the more we take from these waters, the more we find ourselves continuing to be thirsty for something else. Jesus is there for her and for all of us to overcome our spiritual dehydration. He wants to cool our heat stroke of sin and wanting and heal us from the inside outward. Jesus wants to give us that water that is eternal, that water that never leaves us thirsty, that water that is freely given and which we are not asked to hold on to and seek out more of, but in fact to take what Jesus gives us and share it with others, to give it away. By receiving that grace from God through Jesus and then using it as the source that we offer freely to others, that is where we begin to realize where true happiness waits, where true joy is present, where freedom of those burdens we carry are removed from us, are given to us, and fulfillment that comes and continues to replenish itself and never fails us. The story this morning ends with that Samaritan woman laying down her water jar to Jesus and doing just what Jesus wanted her to do, running into that town to tell others about Jesus, who has recognized everything she's done and made all of that no longer stifling or painful, but replenishing, revived, and freeing from the burdens that have beset her. Jesus wants to do this for each and every one of us. He wants to give us water that heals us and sustains us and never goes away. And he asks us then to go out as thirsty people and give that message to those who thirst for living water as well. May we have the ability to say to Jesus, "Sir, give us this water." Amen.